96 hours. That is the maximum window that existed between the moment a DEA operational briefing was finalized and the moment the cartel knew what was in it. 11 operations. 11 times an enforcement team staged, confirmed intelligence, locked down communications, and moved on a target. 11 times the target was gone. Not delayed. Not partially disrupted. Gone, personnel evacuated, product relocated, staging areas sanitized, digital infrastructure wiped. Each time with a precision that told the investigators reviewing the wreckage that this was not luck. This was not counter-surveillance. This was someone in the room. Someone with a clearance, a DEA credential, and access to every operational plan the task force had built. Someone who had been turning over the agency's most sensitive enforcement work to a cartel handler for 2 years and 7 months, collecting payments, watching colleagues plan operations that he was quietly dismantling from the inside. The cartel called him by a code name. His colleagues called him a trusted senior agent. DEA Hunter called him what the evidence eventually proved he was. This is DEA Hunter. The investigation that identified the leak did not begin as an internal affairs matter. It began as an operational anomaly review, a standard post-failure assessment conducted after the 7th consecutive unsuccessful operation targeting a major fentanyl and methamphetamine distribution network operating across 3 states. 7 failures in 14 months. Each one clean. Each one producing the same result, law enforcement arriving at a prepared, sanitized location with nothing to show for weeks of surveillance, source development, and operational planning. The supervisory special agent leading the task force had attributed the first 3 failures to operational security lapses, the unavoidable reality that cartel counter-surveillance capabilities had grown sophisticated enough to detect law enforcement positioning in some operational environments. The 4th failure had generated internal concern but no formal investigation. The 5th had produced a formal operational security review that found no specific breach point. The 6th had been accompanied by a written assessment suggesting that the target network's intelligence capabilities might include human sources within the law enforcement community. But the assessment had not identified a specific individual or access point and had recommended enhanced information compartmentalization going forward. The 7th failure made compartmentalization moot. The operation had been planned using the enhanced protocols recommended after the 6th failure, reduced briefing lists, need-to-know restrictions on target location data until within 24 hours of execution, no written operational orders until the briefing window. The target had still been gone when the entry team arrived. Whatever the leak mechanism was, it had survived the enhanced protocols. That meant one of 2 things. Either the leak was operating at a level of access that the enhanced protocols had not restricted, or the enhanced protocols themselves had been compromised by someone who knew they were being implemented and had adjusted the information pathway accordingly. Both of those possibilities pointed toward a senior individual with deep operational familiarity. Not a peripheral figure with incidental access. Someone at the center. The internal investigation opened without notifying the task force structure. A counterintelligence team, assembled from personnel with no prior connection to the task force, was brought in under a cover arrangement that positioned them as an unrelated administrative review. Their actual mandate was to identify the leak source, build an evidentiary case, and do both without generating any signal that could reach the subject through the task force's communication channels. The team began with access mapping, a systematic reconstruction of who had accessed what information, when, and through which systems across all 7 failed operations. Federal law enforcement information systems maintain access logs. Those logs are not routinely reviewed for anomaly patterns, but they exist. And when pulled and analyzed with a specific question in mind, they can show things that routine review misses. The team pulled 7 operations worth of access logs and ran the correlation analysis. The pattern that emerged was not a single name standing alone. It was a behavioral signature, a consistent pattern of information access that occurred in a specific sequence relative to operational planning timelines. Across all 7 failed operations, a particular access cluster appeared in the logs, a concentrated review of operational planning documents, target location data, and surveillance schedule information that occurred in a short window following each operational briefing, at hours and from access terminals that were inconsistent with normal operational workflow. The cluster was associated with multiple users. The enhanced protocols had spread document access broadly enough that the pattern was not immediately attributable to a single individual. But it narrowed the field. And when the team added a second analytical layer, cross-referencing which individuals from the broader access group were present at all 7 operations briefings, had access to the specific combination of target location data and surveillance scheduling that the cartel would have needed to execute 7 clean evacuations, and showed the anomalous post-briefing access pattern, the field narrowed to 2 people. One of those 2 people had been on approved medical leave during the period surrounding the 4th failed operation. The access log for that operation showed the anomalous cluster under his credentials during dates when his badge access records showed him as not present in the building. Badge access records and system access logs should match. They did not. His credentials had been used to access planning documents while he was away. Someone had his access credentials and had used them remotely, or the 4th failure had a different mechanism entirely, and the access pattern for that operation was incidental. That anomaly pointed toward the second individual. Not because the credential use excluded the first, credential sharing or theft was a possibility that required investigation, but because the second individual's access pattern showed no similar anomalies. Every log entry associated with his credentials corresponded to documented physical presence in the building. The pattern was internally consistent. His access behavior looked like a person who was careful to keep his footprint clean, who used his credentials at times and in contexts where the access was explainable, not anomalous. That kind of consistency, in the context of an active leak investigation, is itself a data point. The counterintelligence team built a behavioral profile. Senior agent, 12 years with the agency, operational assignments across 3 field divisions, extensive network of professional relationships within DEA and with partner agencies, fitness reports consistently rated at the highest tier, no documented disciplinary history, no financial stress indicators in publicly available records, no bankruptcy filings, no property distress, no civil judgments. On paper, the profile was exemplary. Exactly the kind of profile that a sophisticated recruitment operation targets, trusted, networked, above suspicion. The financial picture beneath the public record was different. Forensic financial analysis, conducted through legal process that took 4 weeks to build to the standard required to avoid premature exposure, identified a series of transactions that did not reconcile with the agent's documented income and expenses. The transactions were not large individually. They were structured to be unremarkable, deposits into an account held jointly with a family member, routed through a series of intermediary transfers that spanned 2 domestic financial institutions and 1 foreign correspondent bank. The total, reconstructed over the 2-year and 7-month period the investigation had identified as the likely compromise window, was approximately $820,000. $820,000 moved in amounts designed to avoid detection through a financial architecture designed to obscure origin into accounts with a surface-level explanation as family financial transfers. The cartel had paid for access to DEA operational planning at a rate of roughly $25,000 per compromised operation, a number that, against the value of the narcotics those operations had been designed to seize, and the distribution networks they had been designed to disrupt, represented an extraordinary return on investment. The counterintelligence team needed direct evidence connecting the financial activity to specific operational compromises. Financial circumstantial evidence, however well constructed, would support prosecution only in combination with evidence that directly tied payment events to operational disclosure. The team needed to establish that money moved in connection with specific briefings, that the payment pattern correlated with the operational planning timeline in a way that was not attributable to coincidence. The correlation analysis took 3 weeks. When complete, It showed that in 6 of the 7 failed operations, a financial transaction consistent with the deposit pattern had occurred within 72 hours of the operational briefing at which target location and timing data had been finalized. The transactions were not identical in timing. They ranged from same day to 3 days post-briefing, but the clustering was consistent and statistically significant. In the 7th operation, the financial record showed a transaction that had occurred 4 days before the briefing that corresponded to a pre-operational intelligence summary that had been distributed to the full task force the week prior. The pre-operational summary had contained enough geographic and target information to enable a preliminary evacuation planning without the specific raid timing, a scenario consistent with the clean evacuation the team had found when they arrived. The counterintelligence team brought the financial correlation analysis to the U.S. Attorney's Office handling the case. Federal prosecutors reviewed the evidence package and determined that it supported authorization for a controlled operation, a sting designed to generate direct evidence of the leak mechanism by feeding the subject operational information that was partially false, monitoring his response, and documenting the cartel's reaction to the false information. The controlled operation required the most delicate management of the entire investigation. The subject had to continue operating normally, attending briefings, accessing systems, interacting with colleagues, while the counterintelligence team and federal prosecutors constructed a false operational package calibrated to generate a documentable cartel response without triggering harm to any real enforcement operation or personnel. The false package had to be convincing enough to pass the subject's scrutiny, specific enough to produce a measurable cartel response, and contained enough that any cartel action and response would not endanger actual law enforcement activity. The false package described a planned operation targeting a cartel-connected warehouse facility at a specific address in a city within the task force's operational jurisdiction. The address was real, an industrial property that DEA had under passive surveillance, but the operation was entirely fabricated. No raid was planned. No arrest team would be deploying. The warehouse had no actual cartel connection. It was a location chosen because it was plausible as a target, observable, and sufficiently removed from any active enforcement operation that cartel activity at the location could be monitored without risk. The false package was introduced into the information stream through a briefing that included the subject as one of a small group of attendees, a group size consistent with the enhanced protocol restrictions that had been in place since the 6th failure. The briefing was conducted normally. The subject's behavior during the briefing was observed and recorded. No anomalies were noted. He asked 2 questions about the operational timeline. He made notes on a pad he carried to briefings. He left the room with the other attendees. 31 hours later, 3 individuals arrived at the industrial property. They entered through a side access point. They spent approximately 55 minutes inside. Physical surveillance documented their presence, their activities, which were consistent with a sanitization sweep of a location they believed had been identified as a law enforcement target, and their departure. Cellular intelligence collected during the 55-minute period showed communications from inside the property to a number associated with a known cartel logistics figure operating in the region. The counterintelligence team had what they needed. The subject was placed under intensified surveillance immediately following the warehouse visit. Over the following 18 days, investigators documented 3 meetings with an individual who financial intelligence subsequently identified as a domestic-based cartel financial intermediary. One of those meetings occurred at a restaurant. Surveillance positioned inside the restaurant documented an exchange, a folded document or envelope passed from the intermediary to the subject, that occurred at the end of the meal. Digital forensics would later confirm that the subject had made a bank deposit consistent with the payment pattern within 48 hours of the restaurant meeting. The arrest operation was executed with the same compartmentalization discipline that had governed the entire 14-month investigation. The subject's operational access was not suspended prior to the arrest. Suspension would have generated awareness. The arrest team assembled from personnel outside the task force structure. Search warrants covered his residence, his vehicle, his office, and digital devices registered to him and to the family member whose joint account had received the routed deposits. The arrest occurred on a Thursday morning at his residence as he was preparing to leave for work. The arrest team identified themselves at the door. He did not resist. He said nothing. The search of his residence produced 3 items of particular evidentiary significance: a personal mobile phone that had not been disclosed to the agency under the device registration requirements applicable to employees with his clearance level, a prepaid debit card with a balance of approximately $14,000 that was not connected to any documented account in his name, and a spiral-bound notebook in a desk drawer that contained what appeared to be handwritten shorthand notations, dates, numbers, and abbreviated location references that forensic analysts would spend 11 days interpreting against the task force's operational history. The notebook notations, when fully decoded against the operational record, provided a handwritten accounting of 11 briefing cycles, not 7. The investigation had identified 7 failed operations. The notebook showed 11. 4 operations that the task force had never flagged as compromised because the cartel's response to the intelligence had not been a clean evacuation, but a different operational adjustment, a route change, a timing shift, a distribution node relocation that had not produced a visible law enforcement failure, but had still represented a cartel benefit derived from advanced knowledge of DEA planning. 11 operations, 29 months, $820,000, and 4 additional compromises that the task force had never known were compromises at all. The forensic accounting of what those 11 compromised operations had cost in enforcement terms was built over the 8 weeks following the arrest. The task force had been targeting a fentanyl and methamphetamine distribution network that, over the 29-month period of active compromise, had moved an estimated 2,100 kilograms of product through its regional distribution structure. DEA product flow analysis attributed approximately 60% of that volume, 1,260 kilograms, to shipments and operations that had been directly protected from interdiction by the intelligence the subject had provided. The remaining 40% had moved through distribution channels that the task force's compromised operations had not been targeting directly, but which had benefited from the network's continued operational security. 1,260 kilograms of fentanyl and methamphetamine, distribution value estimated at between $140 and $180 million, protected from seizure by a DEA agent who attended the briefings that were planning the seizures. DEA healthcare analysts projected the casualty impact of the protected distribution volume at between 380 and 520 overdose deaths across the 3-state distribution corridor over the 29-month period. The simultaneous operations conducted against the distribution network following the arrest, operations now running without the leak, on intelligence that had not been shared outside controlled channels using operational plans that had never passed through the subject's access, produced results that stood in direct contrast to the preceding 29 months of failure. 4 operations in the first 6 weeks post-arrest yielded seizures totaling 310 kilograms of fentanyl, 140 kilograms of methamphetamine, and approximately $460,000 in cash. 29 arrests. The network's primary regional distribution coordinator, a figure who had been a named target in 3 of the 11 compromised operations, was taken in the second post-arrest operation at a location that had not appeared in any prior task force intelligence product identified through source development that had been conducted entirely outside the compromised information stream. The contrast was quantitative. 29 months of near-zero interdiction success against the network. 6 weeks of active enforcement post-arrest, 310 kilograms seized, 29 arrested, primary target in custody. The same network, the same geographic footprint, the same cartel structure. The only variable that had changed was whether the person attending the operational briefings was loyal to the badge or to the handler on the other end of the payment chain. The domestic financial intermediary was arrested 4 days after the subject. His financial records corroborated the payment structure and provided additional mapping of the cartel's domestic financial infrastructure. The cartel handler who had received the operational intelligence was not in the United States at the time of the arrest. His identity had been established through digital forensics and financial intelligence. His case was referred to international enforcement partners, the 11 colleagues who had worked alongside the subject, the agents who had planned, staged, and executed 11 raids that arrived at empty locations, were not informed of the leak's source during the investigation. When the arrest was made public, the information reached them through official notification. Several of those agents had spent months reviewing their own procedures, looking for the mistake they believed they must have made. There was no mistake in their work. The work had been good. The briefing room had been compromised. The subject entered a not guilty plea. His trial is pending. The evidence assembled across 14 months of counterintelligence work, the access log analysis, the financial reconstruction, the controlled operation documentation, the notebook, the restaurant surveillance, the post-arrest network seizure contrast, represents a prosecution case that federal attorneys have described in internal assessments as comprehensive. Consider what the notebook represents. An agent who spent 29 months betraying his colleagues kept a personal handwritten record of 11 briefing compromises. It served no cartel purpose. It was a private accounting, the need to maintain a record in a relationship where trust was structurally impossible. The notebook is in evidence. The access logs are in evidence. The financial reconstruction is in evidence. The warehouse visit, the restaurant meeting, the envelope, the subsequent deposit, all in evidence. And 380 to 520 projected deaths attributed to the protected distribution volume are in the healthcare analyst's report. Not in evidence in the legal sense. In the record in a different sense. The accounting of what a clearance, a badge, and a cartel payment schedule cost when they occupied the same person for 29 months. DEA hunter cases involving internal compromise are the hardest cases the agency works, because the fundamental premise of a law enforcement operation, that the people in the briefing room are working toward the same outcome, has been violated at the source. Every person who has ever staged before dawn waiting for the signal to move, who has ever arrived at a target location and found it empty, those people understand what the notebook means, not as an evidentiary item, as a record of what was done to them. Think about the access logs. Hundreds of thousands of entries across dozens of systems, maintained automatically, reviewed routinely for technical compliance, and almost never for behavioral patterns. The pattern was there across 7 operations. It was findable. It required someone to look for it with the right question. The counterintelligence analyst who built the correlation analysis had been working the access log data for 11 days before the signature became clear enough to narrow the field. 11 days looking at log entries. That is the margin. 11 days and 14 months of careful work that followed. Drop your response below. Which element of this case, the notebook, the controlled operation warehouse visit, the access log behavioral signature, or the 4 undiscovered compromises revealed only after the arrest, represents the most significant detail in how this investigation broke open? We read every comment. If this story reached you, share it. The people doing this work deserve that audience. And the colleagues who arrived at 11 empty rooms deserve to know it was not their fault. DEA Hunter. Because sometimes the compromise is in the briefing room.